July 25th, 2024, a 76-year-old man who had been running one of the most powerful criminal empires on the planet for over 4 decades thought he was heading to a routine meeting with a local politician. What he didn't know was that someone he trusted, someone inside his own organization, had already sold him out. Within hours, this man, a billionaire who had spent his entire life deliberately dressing like a farmer, hiding in cattle ranches, and crawling through riverbeds to escape the military, was hooded, handcuffed, thrown into the back of a pickup truck, and forced onto a private plane. And when that plane landed, it landed in the United States. Now, little did El Mayo Zambada realize that the same low-profile lifestyle that had protected him for 40 years would mean that when he finally fell, nobody even saw it coming. Not the Mexican government, not the DEA, not even the other cartel leaders watching from the shadows. These are the 7 most powerful cartel leaders in history who were worth hundreds of millions, some of them billions, and chose to live like they were flat broke. No designer clothes, no gold chains, no penthouses, just cattle ranches, rental houses, mountain hideouts, and plain food, while running criminal empires that governments couldn't destroy. And trust me, by the time we get to number 1 on this list, you're going to completely rethink everything you thought you knew about what it looks like to be the most powerful criminal in the world. Number 7. Rafael Caro Quintero, the old man in the bushes. Now let's start this list with a man whose story is almost impossible to believe. Not because of how powerful he was, but because of the humiliating, almost unbelievable way he was finally caught. Rafael Caro Quintero, co-founder of the Guadalajara Cartel, one of the original godfathers of the entire Mexican drug trade. A man who in the 1980s was so powerful that he essentially wrote the rule book that every Mexican cartel still follows today. Now, to understand why this story is so wild, you have to understand where Caro Quintero came from. He grew up dirt poor in Badiraguato, Sinaloa, the same region that produced El Chapo and dozens of other major narcos. He worked in agriculture, livestock, long days, little pay. And it was that background, that humble farmer's DNA, that would later become his greatest weapon as a fugitive. In his prime, Caro Quintero was not exactly living quietly. He ran massive marijuana plantations, built criminal networks across multiple continents, and ordered the kidnapping and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985. An act so brazen it almost caused a diplomatic collapse between the United States and Mexico. He was arrested that same year in Costa Rica, extradited to Mexico, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. But here's what makes this story different. In 2013, after serving 28 years, Caro Quintero was released on a legal technicality. A judge ruled he'd been tried in the wrong court. The United States was furious, and before the Mexican Supreme Court could reverse the decision, Caro Quintero had already vanished into thin air. Now you might be thinking, okay, so a rich cartel legend gets out of prison, he's going to go live somewhere fancy, right? A compound, armed guards, maybe a private island. Let me tell you, that is not what happened. When journalist Annabel Hernandez tracked him down for an interview in 2018, what she found was shocking. Despite having security guards, Caro Quintero was no longer living the lavish lifestyle he once had. He was living in a shabby mountain home in Sinaloa. He appeared aging and frail. He told her that after his release from prison, both El Chapo and El Mayo had come to visit him personally, and he told them both the same thing. He didn't want back in. He just wanted peace. Now, I don't know about you, but think about that for a second. One of the founding fathers of the Mexican drug trade, a man who built something worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was living in a rundown mountain house telling people he wanted to be left alone. But what really pushed the US government over the edge was that they believed he was lying. The DEA put a $20 million bounty on his head. The FBI added him to their 10 most wanted list, and the manhunt that followed lasted nearly a decade. And guess what happened when they finally caught him in 2022? Mexican Marines were combing the mountains of Sinaloa with Black Hawk helicopters. They had a specially trained bloodhound named Max working the terrain. And Max, this dog, followed a scent trail to a bunch of bushes. Just bushes in the wilderness. Hiding down in those bushes was Rafael Caro Quintero, one of the most wanted men on Earth. A man with a $20 million price on his head. Crouching in the brush like a hunted animal in a remote mountain region, surrounded by nobody. No mansion, no bunker, no fleet of SUVs. Just an old man in the bushes. And here's the final twist. His lawyers had actually tried arguing during extradition proceedings that Caro Quintero was so broke and so old that he couldn't even afford to pay his legal debts. A man the DEA believed was still running a cartel worth hundreds of millions, claiming poverty. Whether that was true or not, the image of him crouching in those bushes tells you everything. When you live like a poor man long enough, eventually that's exactly what you become. Number 6. Don Berna, the invisible godfather of Medellin. Now, Caro Quintero was impressive in his own way, but what this next man did was way beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Because he didn't just live quietly. He hid in plain sight in the middle of one of Colombia's most populated cities, and somehow convinced an entire generation of people that he was practically a community organizer. Diego Fernando Murillo Bejarano, known to everyone as Don Berna. Now, if you watch Narcos, you've seen Don Berna. But the real version is far more interesting than anything Netflix showed you. Because Don Berna accomplished something that Pablo Escobar, with all his billions, could never pull off. He made himself invisible in the city Escobar famously couldn't survive. To understand why that matters, you need to understand what Medellin looked like in 1993, right after Escobar was killed. The city was a war zone. Every gang that had operated under Escobar's protection was now freelancing. Kidnappings, murders, extortion, all spiraling out of control. The criminal power vacuum was enormous. And into that vacuum stepped Don Berna, who, unlike Escobar, had no desire whatsoever to be famous. See, Escobar wanted to be a politician. He wanted to be loved. He built housing projects with his name on them. He gave away money publicly. He was on the covers of magazines. And that hunger for recognition is ultimately what got him killed, because it made him a target that governments could aim at. Don Berna had watched all of that, and he decided to do the exact opposite. He didn't build mansions with his name on the gate. He didn't throw parties. He didn't give press conferences. He embedded himself so quietly into the fabric of Medellin's street-level criminal economy that most people in the city didn't even know who was running things. He controlled every gang through a system of fees and rules. Pay your percentage, follow the code, or face consequences. No drama, no spectacle. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. Don Berna's period of control became sarcastically known in Colombia as Don Bernability, a play on the Spanish word for governability, because the homicide rate in Medellin actually dropped dramatically under his reign. He was running the city more effectively than the actual government, and doing it from the shadows, wearing no crown, holding no press conferences, making no speeches. He even fired one of his own lieutenants, a man named Tigrillo, specifically for living too extravagantly and drawing police attention. Think about that. Don Berna was so serious about the low-profile lifestyle that he removed people from power for being too flashy. He enforced the rule of invisibility on everyone around him, not just himself. Now you might be wondering, well, how did they eventually catch him? And the answer is, barely. He actually turned himself in voluntarily as part of a peace negotiation with the Colombian government in 2003, then was arrested and extradited to the United States in 2008, not because law enforcement tracked him down to some hidden compound, but through political agreements. The man who inherited Pablo Escobar's entire criminal empire, who ran Medellin from the inside out for over a decade, who was arguably the most powerful crime lord in Colombia during the late 1990s and early 2000s, was never chased, never hunted, never found in a bunker or a jungle safe house. He just decided when it was time to stop. That is what real power looks like when it refuses to show its face. Number 5. El Chapo Isidro, the man the world barely knows exists. Speaking of invisible, the next person on this list makes Don Berna look like a social media influencer. Because at least people knew Don Berna's name. Fausto Isidro Meza Flores, known as El Chapo Isidro, not to be confused with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. This is an entirely different man, and in a lot of ways, a far more fascinating one. Born in 1982 in Navajoa, Sonora, Mexico, got his start working for Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, as a young man in the 1990s. When Carrillo Fuentes died under mysterious circumstances during plastic surgery in 1997, El Chapo Isidro drifted into the Beltran Leyva organization, where he became the right-hand man of Alfredo Beltran Leyva himself. Now here's what makes his story so wild. The U.S. Treasury formally designated his organization as a drug trafficking group in 2013, and when they made that announcement, it came completely out of nowhere. Law enforcement officials described the announcement as seeming to appear from nowhere, demonstrating the low profile with which he operates relative to his apparent influence within Mexico's underworld. Read that again. They designated him as a major drug trafficking organization, and people were shocked he even existed. That is how invisible this man is. It gets better. El Chapo Isidro has been arrested 4 times. 4 times between 2011 and 2015. Drug trafficking, disappearances, illegal weapons, murder, and every single time he was released, prosecutors and agencies let him walk, which tells you something much more interesting than any mansion or safe house could. This man has connections so deep, so embedded in the system, that his arrests are practically paperwork. The United States indicted him in 2019 on charges of trafficking cocaine, heroin, meth, and marijuana at an industrial scale. In 2017, they put a $5 million reward on his head. And on February 4th, 2025, he was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, putting him alongside some of the most dangerous people on the planet. And yet, almost nobody knows this man's face. Almost nobody knows how he lives, where he sleeps, what he eats, or what he looks like on a Tuesday afternoon. He is considered by U.S. authorities to be a high-profile drug trafficker on par with figures like El Chapo Guzman and El Mayo Zambada, and the world barely knows he exists. That is the lifestyle. That is the strategy. Total, deliberate, disciplined invisibility. While other narcos were posting photos of gold-plated guns and Lamborghinis on Instagram and getting arrested because of it, El Chapo Isidro has been sitting somewhere in Sinaloa running $1 billion operation and making sure nobody can find a single photo of his living room. Believe it or not, in the cartel world, that kind of boring, quiet, unremarkable life might be the most dangerous thing of all. Number 4. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the godfather who went to church. Now let me tell you about the man who essentially created the template that every modern Mexican cartel boss has tried to copy. A man so effective at hiding in plain sight that he wasn't living in mountains or safe houses or rental shacks. He was living in a house in Guadalajara, going to church on Sundays, taking his kids to school, shaking hands with politicians, and simultaneously controlling every single drug trafficking corridor across the entire U.S.-Mexico border. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, El Padrino, the Godfather. In the 1980s, Félix Gallardo was the most powerful drug lord in Mexico's history up to that point. His Guadalajara cartel didn't just traffic drugs. It established the structure, the roots, the alliances, and the corruption networks that every cartel operating today is still built on. He was the original architect, and without him, there is no Sinaloa cartel, no Juarez cartel, no Tijuana cartel. They all came from what he built. Now, to understand just how audacious his lifestyle was, you have to understand the time period. The 1980s in Mexico were a different world. Narcos with money either fled to remote compounds or flaunted their wealth in ways that made them obvious targets. That was the model. Be rich, be powerful, be visible enough to intimidate. Félix Gallardo looked at all of that and said, no. He dressed like a businessman. Conservative clothes, nothing flashy. He drove an unremarkable car. He lived in a home in Guadalajara that looked like any other upper-middle-class property in the city. He had a legitimate driver's license. He was openly photographed with sitting Mexican governors at public events because he presented himself as a successful entrepreneur, a legitimate businessman, a respectable member of society. His neighbors had no idea. And here's what makes this even more extraordinary. Félix Gallardo wasn't just hiding from the police. He was holding operational meetings in that ordinary house, coordinating shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars from a normal-looking kitchen table, bribing officials while attending community events, running the largest criminal organization in Mexico, while maintaining a cover so clean that local authorities had no file on him. But what really pushed the U.S. government over the edge was the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena in 1985. That killing, ordered by those within his organization, put American heat on Mexico unlike anything that had come before. The DEA launched an unprecedented pressure campaign on the Mexican government, essentially demanding action. And even then, it took 4 more years to bring Félix Gallardo down. He was finally arrested in 1989, not because some high-tech surveillance system cracked his location, but because the political pressure from Washington became impossible to ignore. And even in prison, he reportedly continued running elements of his organization from his cell for years afterward. The man who built modern Mexico's drug trade, worth hundreds of millions, ran his empire from an ordinary house in a residential neighborhood, went to church, sent his kids to school, and shook hands with politicians. That is the Godfather lifestyle. And it worked for over a decade. Number 3. El Mencho, the rancher who ran the world's most violent cartel. Now we're getting into the top 3. And believe it or not, the stories only get more incredible from here. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, the founder and boss of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, the organization responsible for flooding the United States with fentanyl. The man who, at the time of his death in February 2026, had a combined $15 million US and Mexican government reward on his head, and was considered by the DEA to be the single most dangerous drug lord on earth. Let me tell you how El Mencho lived. Not how you'd imagine. Not how narco culture usually looks. The DEA agent specifically tasked with capturing him actually explained it publicly. He said, he doesn't mind living in the mountains like a rancher. That complicates capturing him. Where was El Chapo captured? It was always in the cities. El Mencho wouldn't do that. He hid in the mountainous areas of Jalisco, Michoacan, and Colima, constantly moving, rarely staying in any one place long enough to be tracked. He traveled across mountains and rural terrain specifically because they provided multiple escape routes. Not a single photograph of him in a mansion. Not a single Instagram post. Nothing. Now, to understand what makes this so significant, you need to understand what the CJNG actually was. This wasn't some small regional gang. By the time of El Mencho's death, the CJNG had operations in over 35 countries. They were responsible for the majority of the fentanyl pouring into the United States, fentanyl killing tens of thousands of Americans every single year. This was a global criminal enterprise worth billions of dollars, and the man running it was sleeping in rural mountain properties and moving between farmhouses. But here's what really makes this story something else. When El Mencho was finally killed in a Mexican military operation in Tapalpa, Jalisco in February 2026, reporters rushed to photograph his last hideout, and what they found broke every expectation. The house was a rental property. Small rooms, bare walls in the living room, a messy kitchen. Inside, they found 2 large refrigerators typically used for freezing meat and fish, medicines for a kidney condition he had been suffering from, ketchup, mustard, bread, cookies, water, soft drinks, coffee, and inflatable toys. like the kind you blow up for children at a birthday party. That was it. That was the hideout of the most wanted man in Mexico and one of the most wanted men in the United States. Not a panic room, not an underground bunker, not a fleet of armored vehicles parked outside. A rental house with bare walls, kidney medicine, and inflatable toys. And the location? He wasn't hiding in some remote mountain village with no roads. He was living in Tapalpaca, a charming tourist town, where the population actually doubles on weekends with visitors from Guadalajara. He was hiding in a town full of tourists, blending in, being no one. Pop quiz. How many years do you think El Mencho successfully evaded the combined force of the Mexican military, the DEA, and the CIA? Maybe you're thinking, 5 years, maybe 10 years. Let me tell you, El Mencho ran the CJNG from around 2010 until his death in February 2026. That's 16 years. 16 years as the most wanted man in Mexico. And his biggest secret was living like he was nobody special. Number 2, Dawood Ibrahim, the billionaire who takes afternoon naps. Before we get to number 1, I need to tell you about a man who took the concept of hiding in plain sight to a completely different level. Because while all the cartel bosses we've talked about so far were hiding in Mexico or Colombia, this man built a multi-billion-dollar criminal empire spanning South Asia, the Middle East, and beyond, and has been hiding from India's intelligence services for over 3 decades. Dawood Ibrahim, D Company, India's most wanted man, the man behind the 1993 Mumbai bombings that killed over 250 people. A crime boss whose network spans drug trafficking, money laundering, arms dealing, cricket match fixing, Bollywood financing, and terrorism, all at the same time. Now India says he's in Pakistan. Pakistan says they don't know anything about it. And for 30+ years, this game of Schrodinger's crime boss has continued, with nobody able to officially confirm where he is, what he looks like today, or exactly how he lives. But here's what we do know. In 1997, a journalist was invited to dinner by a colleague in Karachi's upscale Clifton area. When he casually mentioned Dawood's name, his host was completely unperturbed. "Yes, he lives around here," the colleague said. "We could show you the house." The next morning, the journalist was driven to a large, well-guarded white bungalow. That was it. No announcement, no drama. Dawood was reportedly living in a residential neighborhood in Karachi, like any wealthy Pakistani, with a nice house and security staff. But what really reveals the texture of his daily life is the detail that slipped out from an Indian television sting operation. They managed to obtain a phone number and call it. Dawood's wife answered. The reporter asked for Dawood. His wife, calmly, casually said that her husband was sleeping and couldn't come to the phone. Think about that image. One of the most wanted men in Asia. A man with a $25 million US government bounty on his head. Accused of masterminding terror attacks, running a multi-continental criminal empire worth billions. Taking an afternoon nap. And here's the detail that almost nobody talks about. He reportedly has the same eyeglasses he's been wearing since the 1990s. He hasn't changed his look. He hasn't tried to be flashy or make himself look powerful. He's just an old man with the same glasses, napping at home while governments around the world argue about whether he even exists there. By the way, Pakistani cricketer Javed Mianded's son actually married Dawood's daughter in 2005, in Karachi, at a wedding that people attended. A man supposedly in hiding had a daughter's wedding that entire social circles knew about. That is what real long-term hiding looks like. Not caves, not bunkers. A house in a residential neighborhood. Afternoon naps. Family weddings and a diplomatic arrangement between governments that makes his arrest effectively impossible. Dawood Ibrahim has been hiding for over 30 years. And the whole time, he's apparently been living like a retired grandfather in a nice house in Karachi. Number 1, El Mayo Zambada, the billionaire farmer who fooled everyone. And here we are. Number 1, the story I teased at the very beginning of this video. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, co-founder of the Sinaloa Cartel, the man the DEA described as the cartel's true strategist. The man who kept his head down while his flashier partner El Chapo got captured, escaped prison twice, gave an interview to Sean Penn for Rolling Stone, and tried to register his own name as a trademark. And while El Chapo was doing all of that, El Mayo was somewhere in the mountains of Sinaloa, wearing plain clothes, checking on his cattle, and running the most powerful drug trafficking organization on the planet. Let's talk about who El Mayo Zambada actually was, because the contrast between what he was worth and how he lived is almost impossible to comprehend. By the time of his arrest in 2024, prosecutors estimated that El Mayo had spent decades overseeing the trafficking of hundreds of thousands of kilograms of cocaine, heroin, meth, and fentanyl into the United States. He was described as the principal leader of a criminal enterprise, responsible for importing enormous quantities of narcotics into the U.S. His organization was estimated to be worth billions. His son, in a plea deal with U.S. prosecutors, agreed to forfeit $1.3 billion in assets alone. The U.S. government was separately seeking to confiscate another $2 billion shared by the cartel's leadership. This was a man of extraordinary, almost incomprehensible wealth. A man who had been on U.S. wanted lists since 1978, the year Pablo Escobar was just getting started. And how did he live? He lived on ranches. He wore plain, unremarkable clothes. He deliberately avoided any jewelry, the classic narco status symbol. He was described by people who met him as giving the impression of a simple rancher. Cattle was his passion. He reportedly spent $500,000 or more on prized bulls. But that was his one indulgence, and it fit perfectly into the rancher image he cultivated. His hideouts were works of camouflage. When cartel distributors were summoned to meet him in Culiacan, one described arriving at what looked like a small, modest home from the street. But behind the facade was a sprawling warehouse that covered an entire city block. El Mayo was hiding empires inside ordinary-looking buildings, in ordinary-looking neighborhoods. His preferred base was deep in the mountains of Sinaloa, specifically the region known as the Golden Triangle near the borders of Durango and Chihuahua. Its rugged, remote terrain, mountain paths, rivers, livestock, and El Mayo moved through it like a local farmer, because that is exactly who he appeared to be. In his hometown of El Alamo, El Mayo was not a feared crime boss. He was a benefactor. He sponsored local farmers. He gave money and beer to people in the community. He reportedly contributed to rebuilding the town church after it was damaged in a storm. People protected him not just out of fear, but out of loyalty. In the small town believed to be his home base, a reporter who came asking questions was hissed at by an old woman selling tortillas. Don't even mention his name. Now, to understand just how completely he committed to this persona, consider that El Mayo gave one interview in his entire career as a fugitive. One. In 2010, he sat down with the Mexican magazine Proceso. He gave strict instructions on where and when the meeting would happen. The article gave absolutely no hint of where he was located. And in that interview, he said something that tells you everything about his psychology. He said, "I'm terrified of being incarcerated. I'd like to think that, yes, I would kill myself." This is not a man who romanticized the narco lifestyle. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't building a legend. He was genuinely deeply committed to staying free, and he understood that the only way to stay free was to be invisible. He had crawled through riverbeds to escape soldiers. He had moved from ranch to ranch for decades. He had watched every flashy contemporary get arrested or killed. And it worked for 40 years. While presidents came and went, while the DEA dedicated enormous resources to his capture, while his own partner El Chapo, who loved the fame, loved the press, loved the celebrity, was caught, escaped, caught again, and is now sitting in a supermax prison in America. El Mayo stayed free until July 25th, 2024. And here's what happened next. And believe it or not, even the ending of his story fits the theme of this video perfectly. Because El Mayo wasn't caught by some brilliant surveillance operation. He wasn't discovered by a DEA drone or a special forces raid. He fell because he trusted someone inside his own organization. Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons, one of the Chapitos who had taken over that side of the cartel, invited El Mayo to a meeting outside of Culiacan. The story El Mayo was told was that they were meeting with local politicians, possibly discussing land or investment properties. It sounded routine, perfectly normal. But El Mayo was led into a room. He was knocked down, a hood was placed over his head, his legs were bound, he was thrown into the back of a pickup truck and driven to a landing strip. Then, forced onto a private plane, with a hood over his head and zip ties on his wrists. And when Guzman Lopez removed the hood somewhere over northern Mexico, and El Mayo saw where they were going, it was already too late. The plane landed near El Paso, Texas. U.S. federal agents were waiting on the tarmac. One person had left Mexico on that plane. 3 people arrived in America. The Mexican government knew nothing. The U.S. government reportedly had almost no warning. The plane filed no flight plan. It was a cartel betrayal, one faction using America's justice system as a weapon against another. El Mayo later wrote a letter from prison saying, "I want everyone to know, I did not turn myself in. I did not have an agreement. I did not come voluntarily. I was ambushed, a 76-year-old man, hooded and zip-tied on a private plane. The man who had crawled through riverbeds to escape the Mexican military for 40 years, undone not by the DEA, not by the CIA, not by the Mexican army, undone by someone he sat down with at a meeting. And what makes the final image of El Mayo so perfectly on theme for this video is that when he arrived at his first U.S. court appearance, he appeared in a wheelchair. Not because of the flight, because of his age, because of the years in the mountains, because of the decades of life as a man who chose hardship and austerity over luxury and exposure. The most powerful drug lord in the world, billions in assets, 40 years of freedom, ended in a wheelchair in an El Paso courtroom, in plain clothes, looking exactly like what he had always pretended to be. An old farmer. And that's how Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the greatest vanishing act in the history of organized crime, finally came to an end. Not with a firefight, not with a tactical raid, but with a betrayal, a private plane, and a pair of zip ties. Now here's what's fascinating about every single person on this list. They all understood something that the flashy narcos never did. That in the world of organized crime, the most dangerous thing you can do is make yourself a target. Gold chains, Instagram posts, mansions, famous wives, celebrity interviews. Every one of those things is a spotlight, and once the spotlight finds you, it never turns off. El Mayo drove cattle and crawled through riverbeds. El Mencho lived in a rental house with bare walls and inflatable toys. Don Berna ran Medellin from the shadows with no throne and no announcement. Rafael Caro Quintero was found hiding in bushes. Félix Gallardo went to church. El Chapo Isidro. We still barely know how he lives, and that's exactly his point. The men on this list who stayed free the longest all shared one thing. They chose discomfort over exposure. They chose the mountain over the mansion, the cattle ranch over the penthouse, and the ones who got caught, even some of the ones on this list, weren't taken down because of the humble lifestyle. They were taken down when they slipped, when they trusted the wrong person, when they sat down for one meeting they shouldn't have. The lesson isn't that living poor makes you safe. The lesson is that in a world where everyone is looking for you, looking like no one is the only protection that actually works. So which of these cartel leaders do you think had the most impressive survival strategy? Drop it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like these, real, deep dive breakdowns of the most fascinating figures in organized crime history, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. I've got more coming that are going to blow your mind.